على بلدي لتشوف كيف البحر بيضحك لا تشم تراب بلادي وترسم أحجار ومجدك.
ميل على بلدي لتشوف كيف البحر بيضحك لا تشم تراب بلادي ترسم أحجار ومجدك.
ميل على شاطئ حيفا خدلك من رمل وتذكار صورة بشوارع يافا وعلى صورة العكا مشوار.
ميل على شاطئ حيفا خدلك من رمل وتذكار صورة بشوارع يافا وعلى صورة العكا مشوار.
ميل على بلدي لتشوف كيف البحر بيضحك لك. القدس وشوارعها وسماها أجمل مكان. ميل عنا وسال عنا احنا للكرم عنوان.
وإذا بدك تتهنى الناصرة بتبعت سلام قاعدة بتحلى 100 قلب بوجودك حلو الكلام.
ميل على وادي عار ركوة القهوة عالنار شرفنا حارة حارة قلوبنا لعيونك دار.
ميل على وادي عار وركوة القهوة عالنار شرفنا حارة حارة قلوبنا لعيونك دار.
ميل على بلدي لتشوف كيف البحر
كيف البحر بيضحك لك.
لفيت بلاد لفيت ما لقيت بجمالك ما لقيت ولا حتى جبالك والورد وعصافيرك بتغني يابا ليل 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 ليل.
دلعونا بلادي غنيت وعالميجانا رديت وضحية غازل بدبك وعدت.
Hello. Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a moment. So if everyone can find a seat and get settled in, and we'll get started in just a minute.
ومشيت ياما وشقيت أغلى من بلادي ما لقيت شعر وأدب وعلم وفن وأحلى الألحان.
لفيت بلاد لفيت
ما لقيت بجمالك ما لقيت
ولا حتى جبالك والورد وعصافيرك بتغني
يابا ليل 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 ليل.
دلعونا بلادي غنيت وعالميجانا رديت ضحية غازل بدبك وعدت.
لحكاية ستي حنيت بلمتنا بساحات البيت ورغيف الزيت وزعتر وشجر الزيتون.
ومشيت ياما وشقيت أغلى من بلادي ما لقيت شعر وأدب وعلم وفن وأحلى الألحان.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Dalia. I am a member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. And I am based here in New York, and I will be moderating the panel tonight and introducing our esteemed panelists. But before we begin, just a brief word. We have a photographer with us in the room tonight. He's gonna make effort to exclude audience faces as much as possible, but there will be some photographs of the audience. So if you have concerns about that, please just find a PFC member after the event and let us know. And thank you so much for being with here and helping to document. And we also want to take a moment to thank our partners for making this report and the event tonight possible. In particular, Progressive International, who co-authored the report, and the People's Forum for hosting us here tonight. And we are also grateful to all of you, who have joined us here, both in New York City, live in the room, and all over the globe, online through our live stream. So thank you for choosing to engage with the work we're doing as we launch this report, and while we all collectively continue to bear witness to nearly 3 years of accelerated genocide in Gaza and imperialist aggression across the region. So to begin with tonight, I just want to introduce the Palestinian Feminist Collective and who we are. We are an anti-imperialist organization of Palestinian and Arab feminists committed to Palestinian social and political liberation by confronting systemic gendered, sexual, and colonial violence, oppression, and dispossession. We believe that settler colonialism and imperialism are the primary contradictions in Palestine. And as a collective based primarily here in North America, we move in varied ways. We organize and mobilize at protests, we engage with political education, we take action to disrupt narratives and events that manufacture consent for genocide and colonization, in particular, the gross manipulations and weaponization of the language of women's rights. We are here tonight to hear about this powerful report amidst the ongoing urgency to stop the genocide against Palestinians and its expansion throughout our region, including Lebanon. This report urges us to confront a very painful history with an equally fitting sense of urgency towards what we bear witness to in the present moment. In many ways, it reminds us to name what we've known since 1948 in this particular way, that Israeli sexualized and gendered violence against Palestinians is systemic and enacted with genocidal intent. The inability to contend with this past, for many various reasons, set the precondition for the acceleration of sexual torture against Palestinian detainees and prisoners in the wake of 2023. This report serves as an archive of genocidal violence in a settler colonial context where evidence, testimony, and information are being withheld, destroyed, erased, or weaponized by the predatory state of Israel. Sometimes it feels like we have all used all the words possible to make our reality known to the world. So this is not just about using the right words to tell a story or experience, but it's actually about a material and long-term commitment to affirming life and resistance in the face of a predatory state sustained politically and economically by US imperialism. This report documents and weaves together Israel's constant, systematic, and intentional use of sexualized and gendered violence as a colonial mechanism meant to destroy the Palestinian people. This topic of sexualized and gendered violence is not easy to sit with, to hear, or to witness. It should not be easy. We also believe that witnessing and documenting are critical feminist practices. And we invite you to take up that position here tonight with us, even as you do what you can to take care of yourselves as needed. The difficulty of learning this information presented in the report falters in comparison to the pain experienced by the many Palestinians who have survived and provided testimonies, and those who have not. So let whatever you feel move you to action. The function of the colonial state is to disturb and destroy the sanctity of life, and we will not abide by that. We will act. So the report itself was researched and authored in a feminist methodology and praxis that challenges the colonial and racialized frameworks that shape how violence is structured and documented. Our research centers on Palestinian testimony, oral history, and collective memory. It is rooted in respect for the Palestinian people and recognizes that Palestinians are not merely victims of colonial violence, but stewards of a land besieged and active agents engaged in a just struggle for liberation. We take very seriously the dignity and courage of these women, men, and children in sharing their stories. And as such, we have taken the utmost care to handle this topic with the sensitivity and the responsibility it demands. So with that in mind, I am very honored to introduce our guests today who have taken up this demand. I'll start with introducing Tara Al-Alami, who is a Palestinian Feminist Collective member and a co-author of the report. And we have Aaron Maté. Aaron is a journalist with The Gray Zone, co-host of the podcast Useful Idiots, and a writer on Substack. He was among a small group of journalists to immediately challenge the widely parroted propaganda about Hamas sexual violence on October 7th, including the now very debunked New York Times hoax, or quote-unquote article, Screams Without Words. And we're having a bit of technical difficulties. Oh, no, ahlan wa sahlan, Hadeel. We are also very honored to have Hadeel Shatara with us from Palestine. Hadeel is an activist and freed Palestinian prisoner. She is based in and joining us tonight from Palestine. So thank you so much for being here, Hadeel. So let's get started. I'm going to start with you, Tara. As someone who was very engaged with researching and authoring this report, co-authoring, can you speak a little bit more to the context? Why did PFC create this report? And why in this political context did PFC create it? And why is it so urgent as a Palestinian feminist organization to take up this task?
Thank you, Dalia, for the beautiful introduction. And thanks, People's Forum, for hosting us. So we're entering the third year of this genocide against the Palestinian people and also its expansion regionally to Lebanon. And over the past couple of years, we've begun seeing more and more testimonies of sexualized violence being shared by Palestinians. And we, as a feminist organization, felt it was our responsibility to take up the dissemination of those testimonies alongside analysis that we deem correct in this moment, and also analysis that we deem necessary to produce from within the belly of the beast, from within this empire. And so I'll speak a bit about the structure of the report to show you why it's so urgent. The testimonies that we include, we start from the beginning of the Nakba in 1948, and we end in April of 2026. They reveal that sexualized violence took place at it was perpetrated by the Israeli occupation forces, but also by multiple state agencies, including the police or other state-affiliated institutions and entities, soldiers, prison guards, correctional officers, intelligence officers, in different ways and using different methods. And so beyond a reasonable doubt, despite denial, our report proves that sexualized violence is a tactic that is enacted with genocidal intent, that is also enacted with the intent to destroy the futurity of Palestinians and to destroy the social fabric in Palestinian communities. And so there is clear evidence that the Israeli state, primarily through its military, trains its soldiers for sexualized violence and gendered violence, which I can explain a bit later why we use this term and what we identify as gendered violence. I think the easiest way to understand this is through the training or the testimonies that have come out about rape by dogs. We have over 10 pages of testimonies in this report about dogs being trained to rape Palestinian detainees and prisoners. 10 pages. And so this is the clearest example of premeditated, systemic, and methodologically driven tactics that are used by the Israeli state against Palestinians with the intent to destroy life itself. And so another thing that we also illustrate in the report about the systemic nature, which we'll be saying a lot, we'll be using the word systemic a lot in this panel, but it's the acceptance, support, and encouragement, also the incitement of rape rhetoric by Israeli society for sexualized violence in all its forms, to basically create this idea that Palestinians are actually non-beings. They are not only, subhuman, but people who are deserving of sexual humiliation, sexual torture, rape, other forms of sexualized violence that are intended to destroy communities and families and also the psyche itself. Another reason it was really important for us in this moment to work on this report is the gap that we've identified in tackling the weaponization of sexuality and intimate relationships as part of Israeli intelligence gathering operations. So a section of this report looks at the mechanics of a strategy that we call in Palestine, but also in this report, isqat, which literally translates to taking down. So through a variety of tactics like honey traps and blackmail, the invention of information that is secret information and is then weaponized against Palestinians, like things like queerness and sexual activity, intimate relationships, intimate photos, videos that are captured through catfishing or, false relationships. We have a section about, the methods of isqat that are used and provide the analysis as to why this form of sexualized violence is specific to the mechanics of the Israeli state's genocidal intent, because they are often used, like isqat is often used in the pursuit of the exchange of information to strengthen the Israeli occupation, its surveillance apparatus, to infiltrate political bodies or resistance groups, and also to eventually weaken these Palestinian political movements, but weaken the ties that exist between Palestinian communities through infiltration and blackmail. And so this, like I mentioned, includes the coercion of confessions that are a lot of the times false, the use of Israelis or Israeli agents that pretend to be Arabs, so mustaribin, agents that infiltrate Palestinian communities, pretending to be Arabs, pretending to be Palestinians. They form these really intimate relationships with Palestinians, specifically targeting queer Palestinians, and then weaponize that information against them in order to turn them into informants or to use them in ways that strengthen the intelligence apparatus. And so this is another way that sexualized violence is planned and very carefully executed in a way that exploits intimacy, sexuality, and the idea is to subjugate and degrade Palestinians on an individual level, but also on a collective level as a community. And so this is a standardized strategy that has been used over decades. And quickly, I'll cover the part of the report about gendered violence. So we identify it as different or an array of actions that or threats that are motivated and or motivated by targeting an individual's gender identity, expression, or perceived gender identity, but importantly, familial relationships that are gendered. And so we look at 5 case studies that we identify, which are not exhaustive, but we just use them to illustrate or to strengthen our argument that this is a method of gendered violence, or a methodology that is used against Palestinians. This includes, of course, like I mentioned, false romantic relationships, the catfishing, targeting queer Palestinians, but also targeting intimate spaces like the home, where, you know, your bodily integrity, your intimacy, your reproductive capacity, things like family building, nurturing, assaulting this part of Palestinian life through, you know, militarization, through the use of artificial intelligence. It extends the reach of the predatory state into very intimate aspects of Palestinian life, the most intimate being the home. And so, you know, AI-generated programs like Project Lavender, specifically Where's Daddy, which uses gendered language. Where's Daddy as in targeting fathers inside their homes who are deemed Hamas operatives or part of the resistance in other ways, with the goal of disrupting, you know, generational continuity and what we identify as reproductive genocide. And so this is not only an attack that we see on the individual body or on individuals as such, it's an attack on the relational and reproductive infrastructure that is central to building life in Palestine and you know, in many other communities, but of course within the settler colonial framework, this is a way to enact genocide by disrupting futurity. And so, you know, a quick example about Project Lavender and Where's Daddy, the mechanisms that are used track and surveil Palestinians based on gender, age, their potential for participation in political activity or specific, you know, political engagement, whether through armed factions or otherwise. And so this is, you know, this is a way that the Israeli state targets kinship and relations and intimacy. And so we also identify this as part of the mechanism, you know, the legal mechanism that the Israeli state has created to sanction such attacks on Palestinian intimacy, reproductive capacity, and continuity and generationality. Of course, for us specifically, the dignity of, you know, martyrdom and death and you know, even the sanctity of our homes that are supposed to be places where we exist in a relatively safe way under occupation is part of, you know, it's not an anomaly or an incidental or a collateral violation to the Israeli method of enacting genocide. It's part and parcel of a calculated strategy through which, you know, the technology in this case, but also what we identify as gendered violence is used in a systematic way to halt the Palestinian present and futurity. The last thing I will cover, of course, is that, you know, just touching on the political urgency, what's really important to understand when reading this report and sitting with it is that this specifically, the use of sexualized and gendered violence is the true meaning of a settler colonial occupation. This is what it means to impose domination over populations in every aspect of life, in the most intimate ways. You know, it also shows how the dehumanization of Palestinians occurs, of course, across genders, ages, in ways that are sexualized. So, for example, humiliation, blackmail, but also gendered, you know, attacking Palestinian men specifically through programs like Where's Daddy in a way that, you know, aims to emasculate them and also, you know, thwart their capacity as protectors of their families and homes. And so, in conclusion, our findings show without any doubt that this gendered and systemic violence is part of Israel's crime of genocide and is used with genocidal intent.
Tara, thank you. I mean, there's a lot of evidence in what you're saying, and part of what you're speaking to is also how in Palestinian life and society, how intimate spaces and collective spaces are connected, including prisoners' experiences, right? Like there is not just the individual experience, it impacts the collective. And one of the primary narratives in the report has to do with prisoners' experiences and the impact of sexualized and gendered violence on Palestinian prisoners, men, women, and children. So Hadeel, you bring with us your firsthand experience, with you tonight, your firsthand experience, and can you speak to the conditions inside prisons from your own experience? Hadeel, if you can hear us, just give us one moment.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can
Okay.
hear you.
Is it better now?
We
Yes,
can,
it's better
yeah,
now.
it's better, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for having me here today, and I don't know where to start from, because this report covers a lot about what's really going on historically in Palestine. When it comes to the prisoner's case was one of the most primer causes when you want to talk about the violence and the sexual violence against Palestinians. You would always go first to hit the prisoner's cause because the Palestinians have been targeted directly by the occupation there. From the experience I have witnessed, I was arrested in 2024 um, on my way back to Palestine. I was traveling, and from the moment you are stopped, especially as a woman, of course, the occupation does not differentiate between genders, um, and they equally abuse the genders. Um, from the moment I was stopped, the mistreatment started, and the dehumanizing process starts once you are arrested and handcuffed. From being strip searched, from being put in an inhuman condition, from the beating process the Palestinians go through on their way to prison. That's all before reaching any prison. From the way they take you to the health check, um, every step on the way to prison is a process of violence in its different way. Um, I can remember clearly being beaten between my legs, being put on the prison door and slamming the door on my chest, being strip searched in an open room. And I knew that the male guards were able to see me. Um, until the day that you enter the main prison that they're transferring you, all the details on the way are a form of harassment, sexual violence. Inside the prison, the case is different. Before the genocide on Gaza, the situation was not much better. But once you get the main prison, it becomes a bit different because through the interrogation process or the arrest process, there's always direct attack against the prisoner. Once you enter the central prison or the prison that they're taking you, it becomes a bit different. But since the genocide, we had cameras in our rooms. We had cameras at the on the top of the wall, uh, fronting the shower rooms. The showers were outside the rooms. We were not allowed to have showers inside the rooms. Um, we had to fight for beds for period in our periods. Um, we faced dehumanizing situation, and the process and the violence that you are witnessing inside the prison now, we can divide it into three main criterias or systematic uh, way of mistreatment inside the prisons. First, they attack your physical health, and this is attacked by starvation, lack or none having any health or cleaning materials, and the way they attack the rooms and they raid the rooms day and night, it does not matter. They would attack the room, they would handcuff the girls, they would enter the room out of a sudden, not allowing us to get dressed with the lack clothes that we have, or the girls who are wearing hijab to wear their hijabs. So it's a direct attack on them. And then they would handcuff us, throw us on the prison yard with gas bombs, light bombs, being attacked by dogs, being stepped on while they throw us on the ground. And the situation now is even deteriorating in a worst way. And the second is to attack your mental health by creating instability on a daily basis inside the prison, and punishing us on a daily basis and creating new laws inside the cell rooms every day. For example, out of a sudden, they stopped allowing us to use the plastic bags that the amount of bread that they distribute through the day. So these plastic bags that gave us became not allowed. They used to come to the rooms during the raids and confiscate everything in a humiliating way. For example, once they did not know what to confiscate from the rooms, so they took uh, um, all of our clothes, including our underwears, bras, and everything. Um, and the way they give you these clothes is humiliating. For women prisoners, they used to put the clothes in the middle of the prison yard, and a male guard used to carry the underwears and start choosing which rooms to give these underwears to and which girls get what. Another way of indirect sexual violence is bringing underwears and clothes that does not fit the prisoners and force them to wear it because there's no other option, forbidding us from having baths during the period time, and we had to fight every single week to get baths for the prisoners. And this creates a case where you're not feeling mentally well and they're trying to break you. And the third way is the isolation they try to create by disconnecting you, as we said, a systematic physical attacks, a systematic mental attacks, and then they attack your existence by isolating you from the world. And when you're isolated socially, you are isolated mentally, and you are being beaten and attacked on a physical level. So you will reach a point where you're feeling that these walls around you are choking you, and no one out there knows what's really going on. Um, and there's a small decision between you and yourself that you have to make. First, you are surrounded by fellow sisters and comrades, and they're you need to know that you have to be strong for them and they have to be strong for you. So the social bond that was created inside the prisons, because organizing inside prisons was not allowed after the genocide. So this social bond and this form of social organizing that comes out because we're facing the same conditions was our only tool to fight imprisonment, and was our only tool to survive inside the prison. Um, for some prisoners, they faced attacks, sexual attacks during the strip searching. Some prisoners faced strip searching in front of each other. For example, young university girls were stripped in front of each other and were beaten while being searched. Another woman prisoner was, during her strip searching, a male guard entered the room. As I said, the door is open, they can see, and you realize this. But at that moment, you decide whether to break or to face it. And for most prisoners, they face it. And the situation is even worse for men prisoners, because they were facing rape, the horrifying situation that they're facing inside Al-Naqab, Sidi Timan, and other prisons. And these are the prisons that we know of. Um, every day we get testimonies from these prisons stating things about the situation, where you would hear horrifying stories, and it's getting worse, it's not getting better. Even with what was exposed, even with what the prisoners have published, the situation was is getting worse now. And all the prisoners who are getting out of prison these days are stating that the situation is getting worse, not only on the prison conditions, the general condition side, but also and more specifically on the sexual violence side, and on the attacks on the Palestinians, and the raids that they raid the rooms and beat the prisoners on a daily basis. So I don't know how to end this, because what's really going on now is horrifying and needs uh, um, an actual step. And this is what this report is trying to do and to say. It's not only about showing the sexual violence reality within the occupation and how it uses it all over Palestine, and the prison is part of it, but it's a tool for us to use it to speak up. Thank you.
Hadeel, thank you so much for what you shared. And absolutely, a part of this report is about confronting narrative and knowledge. So Aaron, we'd like to turn to you to build on the discussion. The investigative piece that you co-authored in The Gray Zone is frequently cited in the report. How did the narratives about gendered and sexualized violence taken as fact after October 7th accelerate and launder genocide?
Hi. I first want to thank Hadeel for sharing her testimony. I'm very honored to share this stage with you and Tara and Dalia and the Palestinian Feminist Collective. Thank you for putting out this report, along with Progressive International, and to the People's Forum for hosting us. Israel's goal the goal by Israel after October 7th was to destroy Palestinian society in Gaza and continue the Nakba. And to do that, you have to dehumanize not just Hamas, but the entire population of Gaza, to portray the people of Gaza as so savage, so barbaric, that there can't be any talk of a negotiated solution, of a captive exchange, of a ceasefire. They had to be wiped out. And so to do that, Israel tapped into familiar Orientalist Islamophobic tropes. They first tried the beheaded babies claim, which was parroted across the corporate media. CNN reported it as fact that 40 beheaded babies were found at one kibbutz, based solely on the fact that the Israeli government had told them that. And so to them, that was deemed to be sufficient corroboration to put this on the air. But that didn't work because to claim that 40 babies were beheaded, you have to produce some evidence for that. And quickly it was apparent there was none. But that didn't stop even Joe Biden from repeating it, even claiming himself that he had seen photographs of beheaded babies. But the familiar problem of evidence came up against that. So there had to be a new narrative. And what was that? Well, it was to weaponize the issue of sexual violence, which is a lot trickier to challenge because unlike the beheaded babies, this time the claim was that all the victims were dead. So we didn't have to identify any survivors or hear their testimony. And it's also just a more sensitive topic to challenge. I mean, as we're discussing it today, it's an uncomfortable topic, the issue of sexual violence. And people don't want to be seen to be denying something so horrific. And so that's what took hold. And this culminated in this New York Times story that was put out at the end of December 2023, right as the world had seen in horror what Israel was doing for the previous 2 months of mass murder, and there was growing pressure for a halt. So this New York Times story, screams without words, appears, and what does it say? It says that there is that they found evidence of a pattern of gender-based sexual violence by Hamas on October 7th. And the story, I think, is the biggest fraud in Western journalism ever. I can't think of a bigger fraud. Everything about it was fraudulent on so many levels, just on the evidentiary level, on the journalism level. I'm not going to go through everything wrong with it because it would just take too long, and by now it's been so thoroughly debunked, it's sort of demeaning to even discuss it, but just a few facets of it. They put on the cover of the story a family of an Israeli woman named Gal Abdush, and the Times called Gal Abdush, who died on October 7th, they called her the symbol of sexual violence by Hamas and said that she was likely raped. And her family was featured as the cover image. But immediately after the story, the family came out and said, no, this is impossible. We spoke to her right before she died. Literally was on the phone with her a minute before. There's no way she was raped. So the symbol used to make the claim of Hamas sexual violence, according to the Times, turned out to be completely fake. And by the way, another aspect of this was that it's not even clear how she died. It's quite possible she was killed by Israeli Hellfire missiles as Israel enacted the Hannibal Directive, another aspect of October 7th propaganda that is still completely whitewashed. So the supposed Exhibit A of sexual violence by Hamas was not a victim of sexual violence. And all the story had left was a series of claims by a bunch of people claiming to be witnesses, and all of them were transparently false. One of the key witnesses was a member of a group called Zaka, which took part in collecting some of the bodies on October 7th. And this guy turned out to be someone who had spread an earlier piece of atrocity propaganda about a fetus being cut out of a womb. And this was the Times witness deemed to be credible. So that's him. And then there was someone else who claimed to have seen Hamas fighters carrying 3 severed heads. And the problem with that story becomes, okay, well, if you claim there are 3 severed heads, where are they? And of course, there were none. And after we pointed that out, the Times published a follow-up piece 2 months later claiming that, oh yeah, by the way, Israeli police have told us they found 3 severed heads without offering any further detail. Except there was another problem with that. No Israeli police officer said that publicly. So either this was a complete lie reprinted in the Times, or the Israeli police had managed to find 3 severed heads and only shared that with one outlet, the New York Times, which had previously published a claim based on a witness who was making all sorts of other lurid claims that I'm not even going to repeat here because they're just so beyond the pale. And there were others as well. Another witness was a former Israeli soldier named Yossi Cohen, whose story changed multiple times. In fact, in his first interview after October 7th, he didn't even mention witnessing any sexual violence. And all of a sudden, by the time the Times came knocking, he had remembered seeing some horrific gang rape, which of course didn't exist. So there were so many problems with the story, and then there was the fact that the people who wrote it, one of the authors was a former Israeli Air Force intelligence official who had liked on social media a post celebrating the destruction of Gaza. The post that she liked actually said we should turn Gaza into a slaughterhouse. She claimed that this like was inadvertent, but she also endeavored, and she admitted to going out and trying to find evidence of a story that she knew was baseless. So that was the personnel. So you have the journalistic fraud. No evidence, and by the way, despite all the surveillance that exists inside of Israel, despite the fact that like you have a music festival where you have thousands of people with cameras, there wasn't a single piece of visual evidence, there wasn't a single piece of forensic or physical evidence. And their excuse for that was that, well, you know, Jewish burial rituals prevented us from collecting the evidence. Okay, so you want us to believe there's this mass rape campaign, but you can't produce one piece of physical or forensic evidence. And that remains the case today. And in fact, and moreover, finally, there wasn't one single identified victim. Not one. Not one survivor, dead or alive. Not one survivor living, and not one even slain victim. They couldn't name even one single person. And the one person they tried to name, as I mentioned above, her family immediately refuted that. So that screams without words. And despite the fact that it was a transparent fraud, it stuck. It became commonplace. If you listen to any single politician justifying arming Israel during this time, they would always say rape. And this morphed into another piece of fiction called Screams Before Silence, which is a documentary, a purported documentary put out by Sheryl Sandberg, a former Facebook executive, relying on many of the same debunked fraudsters claiming to be witnesses. That documentary was even shown at the White House. Kamala Harris did a screening at the White House of that fraud documentary. And this laid down the narrative for Israel continuing to carry out genocide throughout this whole time. And it came to a point where even people like Bernie Sanders, who was critical of Israel, who, you know, eventually called for blocking military shipments to Israel, even he said in the early stages, you can't reach a ceasefire with Hamas. You can't. And AIPAC even put out a video using Bernie Sanders' clip. And this is a result of this propaganda campaign that we were subjected to. So journalistically, it's a complete fraud. It's also a complete fraud and purely evil because, as we're hearing today, it's a pure act of projection. As this report documents, Israel, since at least the Nakba, has been carrying out sexual violence on a mass scale. And it was used for one of the most evil acts in human history, the destruction of Gaza. And we live in such a propagandized, bigoted society that even today, despite the fact that the New York Times has been debunked so many times, despite the fact that the New York Times' own internal podcast called The Daily, which always recycles propaganda, even they couldn't do a episode on the story because it was such a transparent fraud. So that's the story of Screams Without Words.
Thank you. Just sitting here, you know, with Hadeel's testimony and knowing the endless testimonies that exist compared to just utter lies and propaganda, it's just, you know, enraging, to say the least. And we do know there has been a genocide. It's been live streamed. We've been witnessing it for 3 years daily. And this report, Tara, I'm going to turn back to you to come back to some of the central points of the report. It is centered on the argument that sexualized and gendered violence against Palestinians is key and central to the settler colonial project of Israel since 1948. What is the basis, really the fundamental basis of the argument that this is part of the genocidal campaign against Palestinians?
I'll start by adding to Aaron's response and also Hadeel's testimony. The problem with the October 7 mass rape hoax is that first it was, proliferated by corporate media without question, but also that within what we considered leftist spaces, it was transformed into a situation that can fit within the wartime rape paradigm, which effectively removes the context of settler colonialism and also the Zionist project's long history of sexualized violence against Palestinians. It strips the idea of or the action of rape from the context within which it materializes, but also it completely ignores the power structures that exist and uses war or conflict as an explanation. And so our research for this report accounts for the structural colonial power relations that shape the way that gendered and sexualized violence occurs and the way that it's enacted with specific intent to annihilate. We also cite a scholar in the report, Sarah Deer, and her book, The Beginning of the End of Rape, where she touches on what Hadeel offered in her testimony about the different ways that you are attacked as a Palestinian, physically, mentally, emotionally, and also in a way that separates you from yourself. And Sarah Deer, in her analysis, shows that sexualized violence and gendered violence is part and parcel of the intrusion on land and culture by a hostile occupier, a colonizer, and an outsider. So victims and survivors of rape in this settler colonial context experience this dynamic where the dynamic of colonialism and conquest is played out on their bodies as individuals, their souls, their psyche, but also is utilized for collective destruction. And this is why we use genocide, this is why we say that the sexualized violence and gendered violence is part of genocidal intent, because it is done in a structural way that is intended to destroy communities, not an incidental or collateral or an abnormal, aberration, I guess, to regular patterns of genocide within the Zionist project. And so that's what our findings reveal. They show that rape and torture and violence, the invasion of homes, of intimate life, began with the beginning or the establishment of the Zionist project in Palestine. In 1948, we include testimonies of sexual enslavement from survivors of the Nakba, but also from diaries of early settlers who were part of the Zionist militias that depopulated entire villages in Palestine in the territories occupied in 48. And even back then, there's evidence in their own writings, but also from survivors, that this was done in an intentional and systematic way that was authorized by the leadership of the gangs that eventually turned into the Israeli occupation forces and then were embedded into the Zionist state structure. And so all this evidence shows that wherever Palestinian life is made or nurtured or confined or protected or buried, it's systematically targeted by the Israeli state. The second thing, or the second basis for our argument that this is done with genocidal intent, is that it's derived from a coordinated policy. Again, it's not a lone act of criminality. It's systematic. It's carried out with consistency that can only be a result of direct protocols, not, a singular cartoonishly evil soldier or settler, but rather someone who is part and parcel of the colonial project. And so this is a standardized implementation of the practice, from sexual humiliation to what Hadeel mentioned about, being forced to strip naked in front of others, being given underwear that does not fit you, all the way to being physically, sexually tortured. And this happens, of course, from intimate spaces like the homes to carceral spaces like the prisons. And so, yes, it's coordinated, it's patterned, and it's also, a marker of this genocidal intent to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, which I touched on in my last response about the devastating impact that torture and trauma and injury has on the social fabric. The way that it intends to break apart communities, for example, through infiltration, the weaponization of information that is false or secret, and also, the just outright dehumanization of Palestinians in every possible way. The first part of the report looks at testimonies of sexualized violence in a chronological way, and it also analyzes the way that it transformed from acts that are coordinated and carried out by these early Zionist gangs into part of the state structure. Like I mentioned, there are diary entries from the beginning of the Nakba by soldiers, but also testimonies from survivors. And then we have a really long section on the period after the June 1967 war, where we started seeing an increase. And I want to mention, a lack of evidence doesn't mean that it did not happen. It's rather that people were providing testimonies, but an increase in sexualized violence and torture of Palestinian prisoners. One of the most known cases is the case of Rasmiya Aoudeh, who was forced to strip naked, was raped in front of her father, and also her father during her detention was, one of the ways that they enacted sexual torture was by attempting to force her and her father to engage in sexual intercourse. And so this is a decade of a brutal period of reported sexualized violence until 2023, and which is, the second part of the report, which, looks at testimonies from the beginning of the genocide until today. But just to go back in time to the 80s, which is really important, there was a decreased frequency of sexual torture that we found in our research, but this doesn't mean that it did not happen. What the authors of this report conclude, and what the PFC concludes, was that certain methods of sexualized torture and violence, due to international pressure that came after people like Rasmiya Aoudeh had shared their testimonies, after several UN commissions released reports, forced the Israeli state to adopt laws and regulation that allowed for a certain amount and a certain form of sexual torture, rather than, of course, removed it, because, as we said, this is part of the settler colonial project. And so, during this period, all of these international entities and legal entities were saying that what the Israeli state was doing to these prisoners who were released and then offering testimonies was part of torture or cruel and unusual punishment. And so trying to effectively enact lawfare against the Israeli state, the response was, from the 80s to the 2000s, was revision to penal codes. The adoption of new national laws that legalized and institutionalized sexual violence within the Israeli constitution and their laws. So this was a direct result of mounting pressure, and also evidence that there was intent and a calculated strategy behind continuing the implementation of sexualized violence. And so these tactics were adapted rather than removed, and they were maneuvered in order to undermine certain changes in political pressure, condemnations, and so there was, you know, a Supreme Court ruling, an Israeli Supreme Court ruling in 1999 that ruled, you know, the elimination of certain methods of torture, including the use of bags over the head, but also it included a legal loophole that permitted torture in exceptional cases, to be deemed by the Israeli occupation itself, of course. And so there's a report by Al-Damir in 2003 that, you know, identifies 3 ways, which Hadeel mentioned: the interrogation techniques before you even get to the prison, selective physical torture, and so enacting sexual torture in ways that don't leave marks on the body, which is part of the legal loophole, but also a physical, psychological torture. And then moving forward towards 2014, there was, you know, a rallying wartime slogan by the Israeli occupation, and this goes back to this incitement of rape rhetoric and also its acceptance and I guess, support by the Israeli colonial or settler population: go pound their mothers and come back to your mother. And so the 2014 war in Gaza was marked by this war cry by the Israeli occupation forces. And this is rhetoric that corresponds with statistical increase in reports of sexualized violence within Israeli prisons and detention centers by human rights organizations and primary and first-hand testimony. Of course, you know, after the appointment of Ben Gvir to the position of Minister of National Security in 2022, there was an acceleration of sexualized violence against prisoners and detainees, and then an even further acceleration after the beginning of genocide in Gaza. We identify several ways that are, you know, the ones that I'm going to mention are not exhaustive, but this includes sexual humiliation, so slurs, insults, being forcibly stripped, being subjected to exposure, photographs, mocking, sexual torture, and rape. This goes all the way from groping to forced sex and rape, and also sexual abuse in stress positions. And here I want to mention again sexual abuse using objects and also rape by trained dogs. And it takes a lot to train a dog to rape a human being. Also, part of our report includes an analysis on the violence enacted on international activists, not because it is more legitimate, of course, than the testimonies of Palestinians, but because it's really important to understand that this tactic of sexualized violence extends as a method to silence political critique, stifle any opposition, and also punish any form of resistance to the occupation, and you know, punish any sort of or stifle any threat to the image or of the population, which is ironic because what happens afterwards is that these testimonies are shared and only strengthen the case that sexualized violence is done with genocidal intent. The last thing that I guess the last argument that underlies our key finding that this is done with genocidal intent is that all of this happens because of the normalization of rape and the justification of sexual violence and torture against Palestinians by the Israeli state and the Israeli settler population, by their elected officials, by the general public, the uptake and proliferation and propagation of the October 7 mass rape hoax without any sort of questioning or intent to look into the evidence. And so all of this supports our conclusion that this type of violence is a central method of political, psychological, and physical warfare against the Palestinian people. It is deployed to cause mass bodily harm, mental harm, injury, and it is also intentionally deployed to destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part, and so it is a genocidal act. It was used in the beginning of the Nakba as a method to expel Palestinians from their land. And then during the after the 1967 war, it was used within the Israeli state's prisons to suppress or stifle any sort of political action outside the prison walls, but also within them. And then, of course, it has remained an ongoing systematic tool of settler colonial displacement, as we've seen since the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, but also, part of the intent to ethnically cleanse a population. We also look, or I guess another part of our conclusion is that the systematic targeting of reproductive health and freedom through, these acts of gendered violence, the desecration of martyred bodies, the assault on Palestinian homes, through laws that are again woven into the structure of the Israeli colonial state, the forced separation of Palestinian families, the use of AI to facilitate genocide, and specifically domicide, which is the attack on homes and intimate spaces in Gaza. All of these case studies that we look at in the second part of the report reveal that Palestinian intimate life and any sort of gendered practices or existence are targeted by the occupation, and that Israeli settler colonial violence happens at every level: bodily, communal, psychological, environmental, and also, importantly, national. This is an attack on an entire people in a coordinated, methodologically proven way, and that is the basis for our findings, that this is done with genocidal intent.
The report is so powerful in its evidence and clarity, and the very tangible material impact on Palestinian life. And part of the hope of the report is for it to have a material impact as well. And so, Aaron, I want to talk to you, for you to talk to us a little bit about narrative. Facts do matter, apparently. And the Predatory State report offers a narrative intervention around telling truth and testimony. It gives us a way to understand how gendered and sexualized violence are intrinsic to the predatory state of Israel. And now that it's been 3 years into a genocide that has expanded into Lebanon, from your perspective, what is the political potential for narrative intervention, and what impact do you see this report having, particularly in regard to media and policy?
Well, it's very difficult. We all know who runs the media. One of the biggest media conglomerates is CBS News, recently purchased by the Ellison family, who are arch Zionists, installed a Zionist activist to run it. They've also recently acquired CNN. So in that context, there's only so much we can expect, and not very much. And, on such a deep level, the obstacles are really strong. I mean, think about, look, even the act of debunking a piece of propaganda like Screams Without Words, there's something fundamentally dehumanizing about even engaging with Zionist propaganda like that. I never debate a Nazi about what happened to my family in the Holocaust. Never. I never have to do that. Why do we even have to take the time to engage with Israeli propaganda that justifies their genocide? So even the act of entering in the act of debate over phony articles like Screams Without Words. Even that, there's something even dehumanizing about that. And of course, I've done it, so I'm not trying to say it's not important, but the fact that even we have to engage in the arena of debate with genocidal occupiers who have no right to be there in the first place. And if they have no right to be there in the first place, they have no right to make any allegations. You know, to draw a really simple example, if somebody broke into my home and then accused me of something, you know, over the course of that, would we take the invader, like, would we take their allegations seriously? Would they be given the time of day? No. But yet, the occupying state that has no right to be there, that is putting out these allegations, they're given a fair hearing. And in fact, their narrative dominates. And just take a recent example. There was a recently, in Israel, something called the Civil Commission, which is not a commission, it's just one person, put out another fake report recycling all the same debunked claims from Screams Without Words and all the other propaganda attempts about October 7th and mass rape. And it's this 300-page report, and despite all the debunking, despite the fact that it's citing some of the same witnesses, alleged witnesses, who have been shown to be complete frauds, this report, because it's called a report by something called the Civil Commission, it gets a fair hearing. It was in all the major media outlets, CNN, brought on the author, serious interviews, treated as credible. When, in fact, even inside Israel, the Civil Commission head, as she calls herself, even Israeli officials complained about working with her because, A, she was a grifter, basically collecting money to put out propaganda like this, and also because she was caught spreading earlier debunked atrocity propaganda like the fetus cut out of the womb. So, but yet, that fraudster, despite all we know, despite all we've seen about the impact of this propaganda, is given a fair hearing. Is this report going to get such a hearing? No. We'll be lucky if it's even covered in the media, and that just speaks to the double standards, the complete absence of any integrity that we're up against. And there's one more obstacle that I want to mention, and then I'll wrap, which is that even people who have spoken out against the genocide, who have documented Israeli crimes, our propaganda system is so powerful, and the inherent legitimacy of Jewish supremacy is unfortunately so persuasive for some people that you even have people who've challenged Israeli propaganda still going out of their way to prop up the mass rape hoax. So to take one example, Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times recently did a really important article, documenting the sexual violence, a fraction of it that's documented in this report. And he had, unlike the Hamas mass rape hoax, he had actual testimony from actual survivors and actual corroborating evidence from doctors and so forth. So this was a real piece of journalism. Now, first of all, the New York Times did not put this in its news pages, unlike Screams Without Words, which is on the front page. It put it in the opinion section, and of course did so far too late. We're talking about, this comes out in May 2026. The genocide begins in October 2023. The fake Screams Without Words story was put out in December 2023. So yes, finally, over 2 years later, we get one article documenting actual sexual violence, actually documented sexual violence against Palestinians, but it gets put in the op-ed section. And what does Nicholas Kristof do when he begins his article? He begins it by saying, we all recognize that Hamas's sexual violence was wrong, and we all have to condemn it. He immediately establishes parody, and multiple times throughout the article, he goes out of his way to prop up the Hamas mass rape hoax. And that's a real failure. It's a real failure that even anything the Israeli government says is taken seriously. It's also a failure of our propaganda system, where some people believe that to have credibility, to be listened to, they still have to go out of their way to cater to the propaganda of the occupier and the oppressor. And there's no parity here. There's no parity in an occupation. There's no right to self-defense by Israel against the people it's occupying. There's only the obligation to end the occupation and the ethnic cleansing. And their words, their propaganda should never be given the time of day. And the fact that even people who are critics of that propaganda still go out of their way to pay lip service to it, it's one of the many problems that we face.
in some ways, I hear your response as a call to action in our collective power, because we are up against a behemoth, right? We face a lot of challenges in truth-telling and in the Palestinian narrative. So this report is a call to action to everybody in all ways possible. And we wanted to wrap it up in some ways in that direction with Hadeel. And in this moment, even speaking today with increased campaigns of imprisoning people in the West Bank, you are also an organizer and an activist, and in many ways our compass. And so we wanted you to speak a little bit about our role in the diaspora, in the international solidarity movement. How can we play a role in impacting the prisoners' struggle? And what do you see as the primary impact of this report to potentially have in the prisoner movement?
Um, Compass is a big word. What we're facing now as Palestinians regarding organizing inside Palestine is very challenging. And our voices are being silenced on a daily basis now. At this moment, they have arrested three women, two elderly and one young woman, as we are speaking. And one of them was a prisoner with us and was freed during the prisoners' exchange. The situation is deteriorating, and the conditions inside the prisons are horrible. And outside the prison, we are literally living in a bigger prison. There's a genocide that's still going on until this day in Gaza, and there's a different type of genocidal actions that are being taking part in the West Bank, and there's a silencing in the 48 lands, and they're confiscating everything everywhere, especially in Jerusalem. Um, so now your role is very important. Now seeking alternative media is important, supporting alternative media that is fighting against all these propaganda that is being spread. It's a big war. It's a company's war. It's an imperialist, capitalist war that we need to fight. But in order to end the Zionist domination and occupation in Palestine, the solution is not only Palestinian or a fight for the Palestinians by themselves. Um, we need to fight imperialism. We need to fight the structures of the system that is supporting the Zionist entity. Because if we cut the funds, if we fight an economic fight against the imperialist powers, then we will take a step forward. What this report clearly shows that gender violence, sexual harassment, and other forms of attacks on people is something that is being systematic within the occupation system, within the colonizer mentality. And we have witnessed how the police attacked all the people who were getting out to the streets in the Western countries and in the United States to support the Palestinian cause. They're using the same tools of violence. So it's not limited to the Zionist, it's a colonizer technique that it's using against people everywhere. So it's not an only Palestinians fight, it's a fight for everyone to stop this. When you stand against the police actions and what ICE is doing in the United States, you are supporting ending the occupation in all its forms around the world. So, in order to free the Palestinians and to free Palestine from the river to the sea, you need to fight the powers that are feeding this beast. And in the United States, for example, people are literally living in the belly of the beast. In the Western government that we need to face now and to stop their support to the Zionist entity, you are fighting. So we all have these little fights that would, um, at the end, would all will be put together in order to finish the occupation. So it's not only about freeing the prisoners, it's not only about ending the settler colonialism in Palestine, it's about fighting the system that is feeding this beast of colonialism around the world. Our role now is very important. It's our role to carry this report everywhere and to show how the colonizer mindset is being used and to show the reality about what's really going on. We might know the truth, but we might not know what are the steps to be taken. The steps are very easy. Wherever you are, you know that there are economic entities that are supporting the occupation that we need to boycott. We know that our government are supporting in one way or another the occupation. The only way now is to isolate the Zionist entity and the Zionist occupation. And this isolation begins when we are moving in the streets, when we are mobilizing on different way, when we are holding events everywhere. So we need to fight back by creating alternatives, whether in media, in streets. We need to fight the mainstream media that are covering the truth or using nicer way to cover the truth when it comes to about the Palestinian, or what they put us at the end, at the back page of every news that they put. Um, and what you're doing now is a great example of fighting this mainstream media, uh, getting people out to the streets, holding a lot of events talking about what's really going on, supporting the prisoners, sharing their personal and human stories against dehumanizing them is one step toward uh, um, gaining support, because the prisoners are only a small scope of what's really going on, but they are the reflection of how this Zionist entity actually works. Um, and they are the Palestinian prisoners are the front line of fighting against the occupation. Um, and these people need support more than ever, because we're not only being fought by the occupation, we're also being fought by the Palestinian Authority, and the fight is going to continue, and the prisoners will always find a way to reorganize themselves, because this is the main organizing uh, um, um, place, unfortunately, in Palestine. But this is how the Palestinians have transformed prisons from a place where they try to knock you out and dehumanize you and end your existence, into a place where you understand why your existence is important. And because this is what the occupation is fighting, the Palestinian existence. They don't want any Palestinian to exist anywhere in the world. And now they don't want any supporter to exist anywhere around the world. So it is the time now to hire these voices, to hire the Palestinian voices, and to share the stories, to humanize these people, because the Palestinian prisoners are not just people who are behind the prisons, they are fighters. And they try to make these slaughtery homes a place where they break you as a human, but what they get is a stronger fighter when you leave. And it's our duty to support these fighters. It's our duty to hire their voices. It's our duty to fight this occupation in every way possible, and exposing this occupation by every way possible. Thank you.
Hadeel, thank you. there is a responsibility amongst us in the room tonight. I think that's evident to each of us. And so in addition to this call to action, we really want to engage you. And so we do want to give some moment to the audience, to all of you, to engage with questions to our panelists right now before we close out for the night. So you can raise your hands, and then I can come bring you. Oh, thanks. And Nora will come bring a mic around.
Hi. Hi. Thank you so much for this powerful and painful work. I was curious if you could share more about the report's methodologies and any challenges or limitations you faced using those. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a section at the top of the report where we explain our methodology, what sources we consulted, for what reason, the fact that we only use, that we don't do primary research. There are no first-hand testimonies that we sought out for this report. It was a collection of second-hand sources, I guess, that we cite. We cite other reports throughout the years. We cite primary sources like diaries, and also testimonies that have already been made public. And so we faced several challenges. Of course, there's access to sources. Not only is this information, systematically withheld from the public by the Israeli state, it is also sometimes unsealed and then later sealed. It is disclosed and then reclassified as top secret. And so the evidence, that does exist and has been reported in the early years of Zionist settler colonialism also come from, it comes from Israeli scholars and sources due to, these issues of physical and linguistic access to sources that are housed within the Israeli state apparatuses, whether universities or just governmental archives. And so we identify this not, of course, as an absence of records, but an intentional silencing. It's also not a confirmation that these testimonies do not exist, and also not a confirmation that this did not happen. And so a lack of documentation, which we did face, like from the early years of Zionist occupation, we assert does not mean that this information does not exist because of the structural violence of Zionism and settler colonialism and imperialism, as Hadeel mentioned. And so also, which this is something that Aaron touched on, the difficulties of collecting forensic evidence, or what can be considered forensic evidence under a settler colonial context, or within a settler colonial framework. And so, of course, there's been an intentional destruction and withholding of material evidence that corroborates instances of sexual torture and assault. Also investigative files that have been sealed and classified, as I mentioned. But importantly, the literal obliteration of homes, the literal obliteration of Palestinian infrastructure, and sites where this sort of sexualized violence happens. This is not, an example of this, which I think is important to mention because it does not actually, it's not from Palestinian land, but the Israeli bombardment of Khiyam prison in Lebanon after the liberation of the South. And so this is a prison where many testimonies of sexualized torture, violence, humiliation, other forms of gendered violence have happened. after the liberation of the south of Lebanon by the resistance, this prison itself was destroyed by the Israeli occupation. And so this is a site where this torture and violence occurred that was intentionally annihilated. Of course, with the purpose or goal of destroying evidence or destroying documentation of this sort of torture. The second thing is, of course, the mainstream discrediting of oral history as a valid or legitimate form of evidence, specifically when it comes from Palestinians, not when it comes from Israeli settlers, of course. And so, when this forensic evidence, which I mentioned, is intentionally destroyed or withheld, is absent, we rely on Palestinian oral history and oral accounts of the systematic torture and enacting of this violence in a consistent way within state institutions and outside of them. Of course, there are Palestinian survivors who are living under a military occupation, and so wherever they want to share their evidence, whether it's to the courts, which there are many instances of Palestinians attempting to seek any sort of justice or accountability through the Israeli colonial courts, and of course, this amounting to nothing, not even a case that is heard, or accountability against the soldiers, again, because this is part of the settler colonial project. And so even going to a hospital that is governed by colonial power to provide this sort of forensic evidence is a challenge to Palestinians living under military occupation. And so, disclosing this evidence to colonial entities, reliving the trauma of disclosing evidence to people who are part of the structure that enacted this violence upon you is in and of itself a difficulty for the survivors, and that extends to being able to collect that evidence. The last thing is that disclosure by itself can be dangerous because you are speaking up about a highly or extremely intimate form of violence and torture. And so, you can deal with things from social stigma that of course, we know plagues, victims of gendered and sexualized violence, but also you can, and I want to mention, of course, this is not unique to Palestinian society, but that there are the material ramifications of disclosing testimonies. One of the most recent examples is Defense for Children in Palestine, which is actually one of the sources of these first-hand testimonies that we cite many, many times in this report, of children being sexually tortured, being shut down by the Israeli occupation, and essentially just stopping all of its operations in after a clear and coordinated years-long attack against them, including raids, the targeting of staff, specifically after they release reports documenting the sexual torture of children. And, of course, this, the retaliation of the state includes criminalization or being held under administrative detention, the raiding of homes, destruction, targeting, or just expulsion outside, expulsion or I guess ethnic cleansing, depopulation. One of the most recent examples is the most recently released prisoners in the last prisoner exchange, those that have been deported essentially and not allowed to return to their homes.
Thank you. Can you speak maybe a little bit about the dynamics or any contradictions of referring to or working with, collaborating with international institutions for this report? like the United Nations, for example?
I mean, I want to give the space to Erin and Hadeel if you would like to comment.
I think you should answer this question.
Okay. I feel like I'm talking too much. So within our analysis and in this report, of course, we cite reports that are published by these institutions, like the UN, the Committee Against Torture, all of these different commissions that were created to document such evidence and ostensibly act on it to stop its continuation or its occurrence in the first place. And so we rely on these institutions to provide the evidence in this report. We rely on them to show the consistency and the systematic nature of this sort of torture and violence. And at the same time, we recognize very explicitly that there has been a failure on these institutions' part to prevent, stop, or perform any attempt to secure accountability for the victims of this sort of sexualized violence and gendered violence. There are many reasons as to why, including the limitations of the power of these institutions, perhaps by design. I think it's really important to mention to remember why these institutions were created in the first place, the sort of conventions that were institutionalized after the Holocaust, and who is, I guess, responsible for enacting these conventions, such as something along the lines of intervening in a genocide that is ongoing. And it's important to understand this, because then it becomes really easy to identify the failures of these institutions to prevent, intervene, or provide any sort of accountability. At the same time, I think we are part of the movement for Palestinian liberation, and we believe that our movement, because it recognizes imperialism as a primary contradiction, and because, like Hadeel mentioned, this sort of violence is not exclusive to the Zionist project, but is rather evidence of, or part of, the settler colonial framework. It's important to use a diversity of tactics when fighting against fighting against imperialism and settler colonialism from within the belly of the beast. And so our criticism of institutions like UN Women, for example, which laundered and propagated the October 7 mass rape hoax, which invited many speakers, feminists, colonial and imperialist feminists, to speak about October 7 during the genocide, I think as soon as the first week of the beginning of the genocide. Our critique does not negate the fact that we need to utilize the tactics that we have at hand. And so lawfare within these international institutions is one of them. We, in this report, provide a breadth of evidence that begins in the beginning of the Nakba and ends in April 2026. We provide the analysis that proves that it's systematic, that it's methodological, that it is done in a coordinated manner, that it is not an aberration to Israeli policies or an act of a lone soldier who is particularly evil. And so using these institutions to mobilize people, to also isolate Zionism, to isolate the Zionist project, like Hadeel mentioned, is extremely important. I think like one of the most important examples is the Hind Rajab Foundation, which is pursuing Israeli soldiers through these tactics of lawfare, while also recognizing the limitations of using these institutions and also, the context within which they exist, which is within an imperialist world order or within the imperialist hegemony.
We are nearing an end, but we have time for maybe one more brief question. And since Hadeel is with us, I just wanted to open to the audience if anyone has a direct question to Hadeel. We have one person.
Hey, everyone, thank you. I write for Black Agenda Report, so I'll definitely be writing about this, but I'm also a member of Black Alliance for Peace. And I really resonated with what you said about sort of this unity of struggle around different fronts, right? And I write a lot about Peru and Bolivia and the Lithium Triangle, and I think one thing that the Bolivians are really showing us is what social movements on the ground have known since the start of free trade commerce on the Panamericana, which is a highway that stretches from Panama to Chile. That is our Strait of Hormuz, right? So when you have a country of 12 million, 6 million people are out blockading that at very strategic different points. No commerce is going in or out. That type, I feel like there's something there with being able to open up different fronts and being able to confront US imperialism, US-led imperialism in that way. But so I guess I'm wondering, within the belly of the beast, right, what do folks do here, right? We have internal colonies here. People are mentioning ICE, right? Very clear, links there. NYPD has a literal office in Tel Aviv. So yeah, I guess if you could speak a little bit more to this unity of struggles.
I think it's our obvious fight when we're talking about the imperialist power and how they support the colonial powers around the world. And being in the United States, seeing what they are doing to the immigrants, and see how this is connected directly to what's really going on in Palestine because of the connections between uh, um, the imperialist power who are providing the coverage, they're providing the money, they're providing everything to the settler colonial power as in the Zionist entity now. You could see the tie, and it's a direct tie. So when you are fighting against these powers, when you're stopping against, when you're fighting for the labor rights, when you are fighting for unions and creating unions and supporting workers, when you're fighting for the immigrants and their cause and the deportation and the way they are deporting the immigrants is the same way that the Zionist occupation is using against the Palestinian prisoners. And you can see a lot of direct ties there. If you look at the social movements in the United States and how they are being attacked, how they are being trapped or investigated. It's the same way that is happening when they are putting the Palestinian institutions on the terrorist list and fighting them, even though they are law institutions, they are prisoner law defending institutions, there are children institutions, women institutions. These are the mainly these are the main target institutions that the occupation is targeting now. So our fight is to support the union work, support the mobilizing in the streets, support the freedom of speech that the US government is now denying people from practicing and doing, and the Western government as well. We have seen how they attacked the people who are taking the streets. We have seen what they did in the encampments to the students by attacking universities and university students and professors. So we're dealing with the same enemy. We're dealing with the same structure, and we need to end this imperialist power in order to give the people their power back. Because if you look at the people everywhere, they are all living in increasing poverty on a daily basis. They are living on an increasing dominance on a daily basis. They're dehumanizing people everywhere on different levels, of course, but we are going under this systematic dehumanization of people by these controlling powers and by the ruling governments. Um, so we're talking about the same enemy. We're talking about the same mechanism that they are using different tools, and it's a clear state that what we need to do now is to isolate this imperialist power, um, to cut the funds that they are trying to deliver to support colonizing the world, cut the economic ties. We need to stop weaponizing countries and the Zionist entity is one example, but they're also supporting and weaponizing other countries to create instability inside many countries. They're increasing the poverty around the world. So our fight now need to be smart. Our fight need to be targeted. We need to support the farmers, support the workers, hit back the streets by uniting our work, and it's all for the same cause. Thank you.
I don't think I could make a better closing statement. So I think we can, really take what you're saying, Hadeel, as our closing statement for today, and be grounded in our interconnected struggle. And as you were talking about, in the steadfastness of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian struggle for a just and determined liberation. And Palestine will be free, and it's our role and our position here in the US empire to do all that we can to dismantle and disrupt. And so we really want you to treat this report as a call to collective action and a sustained action. So please connect with us, contact us. There is a protest on July 7th. We want to call attention to Ben Gvir, a primary actor and embodiment of everything that we have talked about today, is shamefully coming to our city on July 7th, and Palestinian Youth Movement, our comrades, have mobilized us to the streets. There is literature in the front about it. Please join us. And there is also a one-page paper in summary of the report that we'd like everyone to leave with tonight that also has a link to the website where you can access the full 200-page report and contact information to how to stay in touch. So as we wrap up tonight, I just need to express immense gratitude to Aaron, Tara, and Hadeel. Please join me in that. And lastly, we do need to head out pretty soon just to be in respect of the space that we're in and the labor that goes into maintaining here. TPF closes at 9, so please continue the conversation and connection and check out the table and have a safe night.